but I was told in caucus from the people that were involved is that the ADA community was involved.
Republican State Senator Debbie Lesko says members of the disability community did have a say on a bill that weakens their civil rights. The governor signed the bill. Now the question is, what really happened? What does this bill do? And what comes next? Joining us this morning, Phil Pangrazio, CEO of Ability 360 in Phoenix. It's one of the largest centers for independent living in the country. Welcome to Square Off. Want to answer that Debbie Lesko question first. You were in the making of this bill. You were in those talks. Were you part of any talks that ended up producing the final version of this bill?
Well, I was involved in some of those talks, and we thought we were involved throughout the process. But ultimately, when the various bills that went from one committee to the next committee, ultimately to the floor in the House and the Senate, those bills always turn out to be something different than what we agreed to.
Yeah, and so here we are. We'll get to the details of the bill. Let's start with, why was this bill needed? Where did it start?
Well, there was one unethical attorney in the state that had sent out 40,000 demand letters to businesses about non-compliance to the ADA. Almost 99% of them were related to parking lots. And ultimately, a couple around 1,100 of those actually ended up in the judicial system where there was a lawsuit filed. But these businesses were being sort of bamboozled to pay in order to avoid litigation. So they paid, you know, on average, it was estimated maybe $5,000 to this unethical attorney just to avoid ending up in court. And
so a little scammy, but Attorney General Mark Brnovich stepped in and dealt with it.
He did, which was really critical because ultimately what the Attorney General's office did in consolidating those 1,100 cases, and then they ultimately went to a judge. The judge threw them all out because they lacked standing. There wasn't really a legitimate person with a disability behind those lawsuits, so they were thrown out. And what that meant is that Arizona became a very unfriendly state for these kind of attorneys operating in our state.
So then this bill comes along, apparently pushed by the Arizona Chamber of Commerce and Industry, state's most powerful business group, making sure this never happens again, but it appears to be going too far.
Right.
Do you think this bill was needed in any way?
It really wasn't needed because of now this attorney got put out of business. And so this bill ended up being really overreaching, and it was directed at the wrong people. What we had worked on was to punish unethical attorneys. This bill ultimately punishes people with disabilities.
How?
By essentially taking away our civil right to access the courts if, in fact, we're being discriminated against. So now these businesses are going to get an additional time, 30 more days.
Is it 30 days or 90 days they now get?
30 days, but it varies a little bit depending on if they're actually, if like they had to go apply for a building permit, and then it could end up getting extended even further.
So they have much more time to respond. The argument is they're small businesses, and you know what? It just takes time to do these things. What do you say to that?
Well, what we say is that they've had 26 years to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Why do they need another 30 days?
Yeah, and so what's the next step? This bill will become law in about 3 months. What's the next step here?
Well, I think it's going to get challenged.
In court?
It's going to get challenged in court.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you think, you don't think, based on the ADA, the federal civil rights law?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And do you think it violates?
It violates the federal ADA, and without a doubt.
Yeah.
It's just unfortunate because you know, this is going to allow businesses to overwhelmingly ignore the law and take a wait-and-see approach. And so what incentive do they have now to actually comply to the law? They don't have any.
Right. All right. Phil Pangrazio of Ability 360, thanks so much for joining us.